Kid Felcha, 1,000 welcomes to the Village Oak Tree for May 15th, 2024. I'm your host, Terrence O'Donnell, and I'm returning to your village again with more commentary on the Empire of the United States. I want to talk about how the empire is failing in a little more detail today and leave you with an anti war poem from someone who grew up in war, according to herself, and now suffers from the effects. Now, to start off with, I'm first going to read you a satirical article from a writer named Michael Campy. I mentioned him before on this podcast, and I'm going to read another one from him here. Allies are us. United States is open for business under new management. By Michael Campy, published in Bounce and Behave and blogs too, medium.com. United States is changing its business model. We're here for you. About us. We've been around for a long time, and a positive change is long overdue. We've decided that rather than just gallivanting around the planets taking stuff, killing people, and installing puppet governments, the U.S. will now embrace more of a service for hire model. Stockholders, after unanimously voting out the former team, have installed a stellar group of forward-thinking young men who are tasked with moving the U.S. into the future. These young men have pointed out that a lot of more money could be made by offering soft services, not to be confused with the soap and ice cream of the same name, although I'm sure no third world backwater country would turn down soap or ice cream, instead of the hard assets we've been providing. Mission. Our goal is to save the planet time and money and to work with other countries to make sure that they have the best options available for all the protest, social unrest, economic collapse, and overthrowing their government's needs. We can offer you the best and most effective prepackaged programs, and we can work with you to fit any need and budget. We have over 200 years of actual boots on the ground. We have refined and perfected these techniques so that they will produce maximum impact at a fraction of the cost of doing it yourself. Products. A friend in need. Our most popular program. We'll be your ally, because who doesn't need a friend? If you need a shoulder to cry on, we'll be there. If you need some advice from a kindly old uncle on your love life or how to dispense with pesky peasants, we'll be there. We can be your friend for an hour, a day, a week, or as long as you need us. Call today and have a friend by tomorrow. We're on your side. Civil unrest. You couldn't do better than partnering with us to provide you with the information and materials you need to turn your country from a peaceful paradise into a seething cauldron of violence and destruction. We continue to refine our programs to make sure you are getting the best of the best. The current protests on our college campuses are a fine example of what we can do to get one group of people fighting with another group while we and you continue to implement agendas in the background free from prying eyes. Our flagship effort in proof of concept can be seen by watching what's going on in Haiti. Yeah, that was us. Tired of the same old leaders? We all know how downright unpleasant it can be to live with an oppressive government that takes everything for itself and gives you nothing. With us on your side, you don't have to live like that anymore. We've got your back. This package includes a selection of new leaders to pick from, several ideological options, ideas on how to defend and finance your new country, information on how to avoid the pitfalls of starting a new country. Most of all, the peace of mind that comes from knowing that you finally have a leader that cares about you and will continue to work with us to ensure that your new regime will be good for everyone. Speed dial T for terror. Every now and then, when you've exhausted all peaceful efforts to get your way, you just have to resort to some good old-fashioned terrorism. Nothing brings the mindless sheep into line quicker than the threat of an imminent terrorist attack. We can provide you with everything you need, from a credible threat to an actual attack. We have a range of options, from fabricated attacks spread through social media to blowing something up that will help you move your agenda forward. For encouraging passivity and compliance in your citizenry, nothing succeeds like terror. Media. We have at our disposal the largest, most sophisticated propaganda machine in the known world. You'd be surprised at how easy it is to bring the public around to your way of thinking with just a few well-placed articles. Let us put our advanced technology to work crafting your narrative. We'll also work with you to create custom packages that suit your individual needs. Whether you need a little riot or protest or a full-blown revolution, we've got you covered. Don't delay. Call today and have the country of your dreams tomorrow. We're the U.S. government. We're here to help. So, Now, I want to read the First Amendment to the U.S. Bill of Rights as a lead in today's commentary. Amendment 1. The following is a text of the transcript of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution in their original form. These amendments were ratified on December 15th, 1791, and form what is known as the Bill of Rights. Now, I got this from the archives of the United States government, founding bills, doc Bill of Rights, transcripts, so on and so forth. So I'm just going to read the First Amendment to you because that's what has the most impact right now, or lack thereof, on the United States in its current form. Amendment 1. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now that's just Amendment 1, and there's a lot of other amendments here that aren't being held to aren't being enforced anymore. So, and again, I wanted to remind people, I wanted to read this to remind American people listening to this about what's being taken from you. These unalienable rights is written in the original Bill of Rights. Here in 2021, the citizens of the United States have lost the freedom of the press, the right to peaceful protest, the right to criticize their government policies, and nearly all the rest of the Bill of Rights, except the right to bear arms as part of a local militia. How many listeners can recite the first 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights? The right to vote is being stripped away in certain areas. Women have lost their freedoms, such as body autonomy in some states and equal pay for equal work everywhere. The freedom to travel across certain state lines if they're pregnant, and more of that's coming. Child labor laws are being stripped away. The separation of church and state is becoming very blurred or downright disappearing in certain states. As I've said on previous podcasts in this series, the empire of the United States appears to be coming to an end. It doesn't have to go down in flames, though. There are ways to prevent the country from dissolving into complete anarchy. Whether the people have the will to do that, though, is another question. Just to add a little emphasis on the financial troubles the U.S. finds itself in the current U.S. The current U.S. debt to other countries stands at $34 trillion and growing. And I'm saying growing every day. They will never be able to repay that money, ever. Think about that for a minute. The country's being looted by the wealthy elite, and the politicians are in on the steal, taking their graft off the top in political bribes. Something Tom Hartman preaches about almost every week in his newsletters. I've been watching a lot of economic podcasts on YouTube lately to get a good idea of just how bad things are, and the U.S. government is hiding the worst of it from the average citizen. As I said before, I get all this stuff from foreign news agencies in Europe and everywhere else. The United States is getting hit economically from all sides these days, especially from China, Russia, and the BRICS alliance. It's gaining more members all the time. They're working hard at stopping the American dollar from being the world's reserve trade currency anymore, something they never should have done in the first place back in the 70s. They want to use their own currencies and are selling out U.S. Treasury bonds as if there's a fire sale, which right now there actually is. The United States has borrowed so much money to cover their expenses that they're having trouble paying it back now, at least in the short term. They issue Treasury bonds to sell for cash. Think of those as like a huge personal loan from a bank, with the only collateral being your good name. That's what Treasury bonds are. Promissory notes stating that the U.S. is good for its debt obligations. The problem is, the U.S. doesn't have the economic collateral to back up the debt now, and the world knows this. Just making promises to pay it all back with a handshake won't cut it anymore. American financial experts are publicly stating that the U.S. should just print more money. This guy by the name of Bernstein did a podcast on this very recently. That will solve the debt and the inflation problem, so they say. Yeah, right. Think again. Even the least educated citizen knows how wrong that is. More and more central banks are buying gold bullion to bolster their currency as they sell off their American dollars and start using more of their own currency to handle global trade now. As one expert said in an interview recently that I watched, the world is moving on from being under the thumb of the U.S. empire. Russia and China, especially. They have maneuvered their way around the sanctions imposed by the West, mostly by the US, and the Russians' GDP is actually growing despite the sanctions. China is having some financial issues, but by trading with Russia and a lot of other countries, especially those in the BRICS alliance, they should be able to overcome most of their economic issues soon, especially if they can figure out a way to sell more EV cars. They seem to have glutted the world's markets for now with too many new cars and other manufacturers' goods, but I bet they have a plan. Where does that leave the United States? Holding an empty bag. They have so many internal problems right now that they aren't paying enough attention to their economic woes. They're spending too much money on the military industrial complex and not enough on their own domestic issues, such as adequate housing, healthcare, women's and LGBTQ rights, education, infrastructure, and the list goes on. A lot of this money has and is going to fund the Israeli war machine. And it's highly unpopular right now, especially with the younger voters, and it may cost the incumbent president his reelection in November. Not sending money and military equipment when they needed to Ukraine has likely cost Ukraine the war. But they can send all that money to Israel to fund an obvious genocide, then deny that there's a genocide happening. Anyone with access to the internet knows how much BS that is. Sending offensive weapons to Israel was a bad idea in the first place. Then failing to abide by their own laws, much less international law, to stop the ethnic cleansing happening has seriously damaged the faith in this president, both domestically and internationally. Egypt has now joined in the suit with South Africa to try and stop Israel in the ICC. And, in additional news, since I even put this out, Egypt right now is in a diplomatic battle with Israel over the Rafah border closing. It would be interesting to see how that's going to get worked out. As more and more countries sign on to this suit, the more the U.S. will be backed into a corner and faced with becoming even more of a pariah around the world. The other question coming up very quickly is whether the UN Security Council will abide by the vote of the 143 countries in the General Council to allow Palestine to become a member state. So, just so you know, the United States was top of the list of 9 countries that vetoed this. But, this is the General Council. It's not the Security Council. I'm sure that the members who voted for this are waiting with indrawn breath to see if the United States will veto this one in the Security Council, like so many other resolutions pertaining to Palestine in the last 6 months. China has come out and severely criticized all these vetoes this week. You see how that stands. So, what if the United States does do this? What's everybody going to do? If the U.S. is the only one to veto this, it will look really bad and isolate them even further. More and more countries will leave off the U.S. and take their business elsewhere. And this is starting to happen a lot now, which could lead to more financial ruin for U.S. corporations. Will more of them move overseas to avoid financial collapse? Amazon, one of the world's largest corporations, is expanding in Europe with a new facility in France. Is this a sign of things to come for the U.S.? Meta has largely left the U.S. for Europe. Elon Musk has shifted a lot of holding overseas. The largest companies left in the U.S. are the fossil fuel corporations, the U.S. ones, the military industrial complex, and private equity corporations, which they own about, according to latest reports, about 40% of American corporations. And all of them are straddling the globe right now in some ways. And I bet they're all working up strategies to enable them to quickly shift completely overseas if the U.S. economy collapses. I have also said in previous podcasts, the United States is becoming an empty shell of itself. Their mighty military is struggling to keep up with their manpower needs and equipment. Ships are falling apart, and they can't afford to make any more. Army equipment is suffering casualties due to lack of spare parts. They're struggling to keep up with the demand of just ordinary bullets. But you will rarely hear about this in the U.S. news, or anywhere else for that matter, other than maybe the Military Times newspapers or other back channel news. You really have to go digging for stories like that. The U.S. military has been the largest fear-creating organization they have, something they have used to great effect since World War II, scaring countries with invasion or sending their military over to assist with training and force protection, and I mean assist, more like selling imperialism with a big grin and a handshake. Despite all their bluster and posturing, How many wars has the U.S. started and actually won since World War II? Someone pointed out this week, one actually, Grenada in 1983. All the others were a stalemate or a total loss to date. The U.S. didn't win in Desert Storm. That just got put off until 2003. And look how that worked out for them. The U.S. convinces countries that it would be in their best interest to let them set up bases in their countries to help them protect themselves from bad actors. Then they don't want to leave, always making excuses on why they can't leave, even when the country doesn't want them anymore, like Iraq has been doing lately. Niger just kicked the U.S. out and welcomed the Russians. I wonder why. More countries may start doing that soon because they are tired of American imperialism. There's been quite a few countries, and I listened to a podcast this morning that a lot of Central African countries have kicked out the United States and welcomed the Russians and the Chinese. So more and more countries are probably going to get on board with this. Imagine if all the foreign U.S. bases were told to close up shop and go home by countries who were never really their friends in the first place. What will happen if a lot of countries bail on trading with the U.S. in the near future? What will happen if they are no longer intimidated by the U.S. military? What will happen if the value of the U.S. dollar falls? What will the U.S. governments do to stop that from happening? Now, that's the big question. Threaten countries with economic sanctions? That threat doesn't have a lot of teeth to it anymore. You can look at Russia for that right now. There are very few people left alive that remember the Great Depression of the 1930s. I only remember my dad and mom telling me about those times, and they didn't say much. Each had their own story to tell as they were children then, but my grandparents never talked about those days. The U.S. is very close to repeating that episode in history again. With mainstream media in the government's hip pocket, the populace won't know how bad it is until it's too late, like what happened in 2008. Very few saw it coming, and those who did tried to cover it up until they couldn't anymore. This time, the U.S. government won't be bailing out any more corporate banks. They don't have the money anymore. The homeless rate in the U.S. is very high right now. Over 650,000 people are underestimated to be homeless in the U.S., compared to over 2 million homeless during the Great Depression. And the numbers are increasing. Imagine if the U.S. economy were to tank severely, which, if things keep going the way they are, will happen sooner than later. The homeless numbers might even exceed what the 2 million or so in the 1930s. That rate will accelerate under a Trump administration as he will steal the U.S. blind and give it to his friends overseas. The U.S. needs a serious reset soon. They need a different type of president who's not beholden to any foreign governments or corporate billionaires. So I'm going to take a break right now, and I'll be back in a couple of minutes, and we'll pick this up on the backside. During this couple-minute break, I have a couple of things I wish to bring to your attention. First, I want to take a minute to introduce MBR Radio and WAA Radio. So MBR Radio stands for Military Broadcast Radio. WAA Radio is Reese Across America Radio. These are veteran-run radio stations in the U.S. Both of these companies are nonprofits and only use the proceeds to help veterans in need. If you're a veteran or still on active duty and are watching or listening to this, check these stations out as there are a lot of veterans contributing to topics ranging from military service to politics and everything in between. Go search for MBR Radio on YouTube or on Twitch and Rumble, or WAA Radio on iHeartRadio, Odyssey, and TuneIn to support veterans with their patronage and support. So now to switch gears. To let you know, this podcast will remain free to subscribe to on all the major mobile podcast apps, on my YouTube channel, Krana Biha, and for the first 30 days on my Substack page, kranabiha@substack.com. With that in mind, I want to ask for a donation of any amount to help me keep this podcast and website going. I would rather solicit donations instead of charging subscriptions, so everyone has an opportunity to watch and listen to this podcast. I'm asking for help to frame the cost to produce this podcast and maintain my website. I've set up a donation tab on the Village Oak Tree webpage at rss.com and a donation page on my website at www.kranabiha.com, linked to PayPal for your security. This way there's no credit card info saved anywhere, and you can use any currency you wish around the world, providing PayPal is available to you. No amount's too small. Now, to find my website, The easiest way is to copy it from the background behind me if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're listening to an audio version, take the website name from the podcast logo shown. Either way, search for it and enjoy your visit. And I'm also trying to still sell some copies of my book, which can be found at any book retailers around the world. You can also buy from me direct in the bookstore page on my website. Fugitives in the New United States is available in hardcover, paperback, and ebook form. Free if you're a Kindle subscriber. It's written for young adults and older, so it's safe for teenagers and adults. If this were a movie, it would be rated PG. Look for Fugitives in the United States at your favorite book retailer and enjoy. Welcome back. As we were talking about before the break, the U.S. needs a new president who's not beholden to anyone. Sadly, this doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon, as the powers that be are fighting that with all they have. The Green parties around the world have a good platform, but the powers will not let them take any offices, especially in the U.S. Right now, the majority of the citizens are brainwashed to only elect someone from any of the two parties, and that'll be that, no matter how badly they destroy what's left of the country, even though there might be a better third-party candidate running for office. To give everyone an example of how bad it is in the U.S., let's talk about paying for health care. I have a story about a man in the state of Missouri who killed his wife because he couldn't afford her medical care. Assisted suicide is becoming a lot more popular. People are losing their homes and livelihoods because they can't afford to pay their medical bills. Obamacare was gutted so badly by Trump that it doesn't help near as much as it used to anymore. It's basically almost not there. The majority of cases brought before bankruptcy judges nowadays are for healthcare debt. New doctors who are looking for residencies to start learning their vocations out of college are avoiding certain states due to draconian women's healthcare laws. The newly minted residents say they can't learn how to treat women's healthcare issues if the state bans abortions and restricts healthcare for women. Laws passed by state legislatures emboldened by Trump when he was president. The biggest thing that will tank Genocide Joe's reelection will be his support of Israel. That bloodstain will be forever linked to his name in history, along with people like Bibi Netanyahu, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and so many other sadistic leaders from world history. Joe Biden and his administration are complicit in the massacre of nearly 40,000 Palestinians now, and the body count keeps climbing every day. I say 40,000 because according to the actual account, it's almost 36,000 people now, but there's about 10,000 people that they can't account for. They're all buried underneath the rubble and they can't dig them out. So the body count, like I said, is going to go up substantially once they start doing that, if they ever get to them. There's no amount of media manipulation that will wipe that stain off in American history and in world history, for that matter, and that affiliation with Joe Biden. His old meme of Dark Brandon has now changed forever to Genocide Joe. Granted, he's making small gestures now, withholding arms shipments, building a floating pier to get more aid to the people of Gaza, making statements that Israel is crossing a red line. Well, here's the thing. He just sent another $1 billion worth of arms to Israel as of last night. So there is no red line anymore. It's maybe pink, if anything at all. You know, as far as the pier is concerned, the bet now is that very little of that aid will actually reach the starving Palestinians once the aid is offloaded from the ships, because it has to pass through IDF inspections. And they've been holding up the trucks at the Egyptian border for like months. So we've seen how they've handled the trucks. And as I replied to a newsletter this week, the Jewish settlers may run up the pier and throw all of that aid in the ocean, much like they are destroying the aid trucks on the trucks right now. So for anybody who doesn't know what's going on, the settlers are catching these trucks as soon as they cross the border and jacking them up and dumping all the stuff in the ditch, and they're destroying it. So is this what the settlers are going to do? They're going to rush the U.S. soldiers on the pier and the sailors on the ships and take all that stuff and dump it in the ocean? Will the American soldiers let them get away with that? Well, that's going to be the question. Someone made the point to me that the ships are coming to pick up the Palestinian refugees from El Mawasi and transport them out of Gaza, to where no one knows, as every other country has said, no, we don't want them. Joe Biden signed off on that without telling it. Did Joe Biden sign off on that without telling anyone? If he did, that will likely be the last nail in his political coffin, along with his government coalition. Some political experts will tell you that these public gestures are only because he's starting to feel the heat from the protesters and the Muslim voters who will no longer vote for him. Maybe he thinks these small gestures will win them back. He'll need a lot more than that if he has any chance at all right now. Democrats are very much out of sync with their constituents these days. Republicans are too, but in a different ways. For Biden, it may be too late now, unless he pulls off a huge miracle in Gaza somehow in the next couple of months. If I had to ask someone today, I would say that isn't going to happen. But hey, stranger things have happened. None of that will save the U.S. economy in the long run, though. He has lost the credibility of the world for the most part and has taken the EU down with him. Trump, when he was president, inadvertently made the EU actually sit up and take stock of their dependence on the United States. They realized that they were in a bad position if the U.S. stopped giving them money and security assurances. They have been scrambling ever since, but they're still a long way from being independent of the U.S., and they know it. You have to believe that the EU Council is working hard to become more self sufficient as they watch the U.S. fall apart. Right now, so goes the U.S., so goes the EU, up or down. In this case, down. If the U.S. economy tanks soon, they know that they'll go down with it, and they're very afraid as they wouldn't last long without U.S. backing. The EU cut off the Russian hand that was feeding them 2 years ago when the war started in Ukraine, something that was instigated by the U.S., once again meddling into someone else's affairs. This time, Ukraine, because they had a pro Russian prime minister back then that the U.S. didn't like, and they saw an opportunity to change regimes. The man they got rid of was corrupt by anyone's standards, but at least there was no war. By instigating a near coup, the U.S. tried to gain another step closer to installing NATO right next door to Russia. Obviously, Russia wasn't going to have that, and now we see the results of that U.S. meddling. So look what they have. A complete mess that looks like the U.S. and the EU may end up losing billions of dollars and euros for nothing. Ukraine is on the verge of losing to Russia soon, as they can't keep up with the pressure since the U.S. bailed on them until recently. But as I said before, it's too late now. Too late, too little, too late. The U.S. and EU likely just threw those recent arms shipments of money away for nothing. When the war started 2 years ago, the U.S. pressured the EU to cut off oil and gas coming from Russia as a sanction. It worked in the short term, but Russia has now found new markets and transportation lanes to sell their products. The EU is now even more dependent on the U.S. and others at a higher price to float. So let me give you an idea. Russia obviously couldn't sell directly to the EU anymore. Can't sell to the US, obviously. So they started selling to India. So what's India doing? They're taking all that Russian oil and they're selling it back to the EU at a higher price. And the EU has no choice but to pay for it. Without the US, the EU probably would be very cold and hungry right now. Same goes for that Russian oil that's coming by proxy through India. Because Europe is doubtful of U.S. dependability, they are now courting trade with China, which is likely making some U.S. corporations anxious as they are afraid of losing business, which means less executive salaries and sales bonuses. I'm sure they're trying to lobby the U.S. government to do something about it. I can just hear the whining by American lobbyists crying to Congress about China and Russia moving in on their foreign sales territories. Wah, wah, wah. Will the corporate leaders try to convince the U.S. to start a larger trade war with China? Well, they just did. Biden, within the last day or so, amped up the trade tariffs with China in a huge way. Just huge, 100% on EVs right now. And I'm telling you, that's going to be a big mistake. We're going to find out here before too long just how big a mistake that's going to turn out to be. So the thing is, the Americans have never been too smart when it comes to bowing up and threatening people if they can't have their own way. Biden just signed a law, as I mentioned, just increasing import tariffs. The only ones that's going to hurt the American consumers. The rich elitists will swat those away like an angry bug. The Chinese will just find other markets. They will take a little hit, but the Europeans, Africans, and Southwest Asian markets will take up a lot of that slack, all of which is killing off the U.S. economy. The U.S. is slowly being strangled, and they don't see it coming in their hubris of thinking they will be the top dog in the world forever. It's that kind of thinking that got them into this trouble in the first place decades ago. They've been bullying the world with blinders on since the early 20th century, and it's now coming back to bite them in the butt. As one European economics professor stated on another podcast a couple of days ago, countries now have a choice on who to do business with, and it isn't the U.S. anymore as the hands down favorite. They don't like all the strings that come with doing business with the Americans. China and Russia are easier to do business with now, and they're letting everyone know that. President Xi Jinping just spent a few days courting leaders in Eastern Europe and France, trying to drum up more trade for China. The Russians are also moving into areas once considered exclusive to the West, such as the Middle East and Central Africa, and other places in Africa for that matter. The Chinese and the Russians have been doing the same in South America and everywhere. Not always successful, but the Chinese ambassadors do get around. They're working at it, which is more than anyone could say about the Americans anymore. The Americans thought they had the world sewed up and sat back thinking the world would come to them now. Not so much anymore. With Russia opening up trade routes away from American influence, they have managed to get around the U.S. sanctions. Basically, that means that the Americans have become a nation that has more bark than bite anymore. As evidenced with Israel, countries are starting to move on without the U.S., and with that kind of irrelevance being shown them from even underdeveloped countries, that money will slow down a lot, and these corporations will either have to tighten their belts or move to another continent. A lot of them are choosing the latter, which makes the unemployment rate climb. But that's not being reported. The U.S. has suffered from millions of layoffs in the last few years, and with only a few 100,000 jobs created in return. That's the narrative in the mainstream news under Biden. Look at all the jobs I helped create. Biden touts that unemployment is down under his administration. What they aren't telling anyone is that there are a lot of underemployed and underemployed people who aren't being counted. Those that have been underemployed for so long or unemployed that they've dropped off the rolls. Those who work gig jobs who don't earn a living wage. Those who work for minimum wage that doesn't provide enough to make a living wage. These are the angry Republican voters who will vote for whomever will promise them a way out of their misery. There are a lot of promises floated about, but as smarter people will point out, those promises are smoke in the wind. Trump didn't deliver in his first go around from 2016. So what makes anyone think this time will be any different? None of the other candidates have anything more than promises to offer either. Biden just promises more of the same, and we can see how that's going for everyone. Those promises are largely only for the wealthy elites, those who work white-collar jobs and make six-figure salaries and above. The people who all lost their jobs after Clinton and the Democrats let the factories leave the country are not going to see much difference still, if anything, probably less. Sure, Biden's encouraging labor unions, which will help a little bit, but it's mostly a token promise, as the corporations will never allow unions to get a good foothold in the American labor landscape. They stand to lose too many executive salaries and perks. And that's the bottom of it all. That's what's choking off the U.S. economy. Greed by the corporations to make insane amounts of money for their executives and shareholders and little to none for the blue-collar workers. And they wonder why everyone's so angry. A lot of people have talked about a possible civil war between the haves and have-nots someday. If so, it wouldn't be a shooting war with armies facing off in fields like the last time in the 1860s, but an uprising against the white-collar elites by the underpaid blue-collar labor force and the students who want justice and jobs. The world is seeing a little of that now with the protest over Gaza. There's no one left alive who remembers the October 1917 Russian Revolution. If you read the history books, things look eerily similar in the U.S. right now before 1917 in Russia. This is just getting started. This pro-Palestine support will continue for a while longer, maybe long enough to affect policies and stop Israel from committing ethnic cleansing of Gaza and the West Bank. We can only hope. How far are they willing to go? That remains to be seen. I hope they go all the way and force policy change before it's too late to save what's left of the Palestinians and the American democracy experiment. It's not too hard of a stretch to see how that could morph into protest against inequality and the loss of civil rights. With all the outside economic pressures being exerted against the U.S. from beyond its borders, a lot of pressure from within may be too much for the U.S. and the collapse will happen. I don't want to speculate on how that would look, as it could go in several different directions. My biggest concern is for all the citizens who depend on pensions and disability money to provide for their basic necessities. If that flow of monthly income should dry up, there will be a famine right here in the United States. Imagine the United States with all the senior citizens starving without Social Security. Imagine all the retired and disabled veterans losing their pensions. The riots would be off the charts. There will be nothing worse than millions of hungry, homeless veterans with access to guns in the United States and the training to use them. The American Revolutionary War would just be an angry tea party compared to that. Add in the students and the able-bodied senior citizens, and the sitting governments wouldn't stand a chance. January 6, 2021 would look like a Southern cotillion by comparison. Don't think these politicians aren't thinking about this already. This is probably one of the reasons they're cracking down on student protesters. The elitists are afraid of them. Some of them do remember the violent riots of the Vietnam War days. Democratic National Convention in 1968 being one of them. They don't want to admit that they don't want to give anyone, they don't want to admit that, so they don't want to give anyone any ideas. Well, news for them, it's already out there. The other reason, of course, is money or the possibility of losing some or all. The United States is a failing state, but they want to continue to make the world believe that they are still the shining beacon of freedom on the horizon that all countries should aspire to. That's becoming a laughable thing now. Even though underneath, the framework is rusting beyond repair and falling down. They keep throwing on more patchwork with a big smile and a wave in an attempt to keep deceiving the world that all is good. Move along, folks. Nothing to see here. Move along. Go, go. There's another podcast guest at another European show a few days ago. The U.S. needs to stop trying to be the unipolar hegemony and figure out a way to work with everyone else to create a multipolar hegemony. This continuing push to keep the world as a unipolar hegemony with the U.S. on top will only end in disaster for the empire of the United States, as the world is seeing right now. If the citizens of the United States want to head off an economic disaster that will devastate their lives even worse than the Depression of the 1930s, they had better do something with the next national elections to change things up from the current status quo. If they don't, the empire won't last much longer than beyond the next 4 years. So that's all I've got this week for my commentary. I hope I have given everyone something to think about for a day or so. And I'm going to publish this on multiple platforms, 3 of which have copies of a newsletter. One of those platforms being my website and the blog, which is on the background behind me, where you can also listen to the show on the podcast page. You're welcome to leave comments on YouTube, medium.com, substack.com, and my website if you choose. I'm going to close with an anti-war poem from a writer from County Antrim in the north of Ireland. It's entitled Mothering, spelled M.O.T.H.E.R.I.N, an anti-war poem by Ramona McCluskey. This is a poem for Reem Ali and her brother Tariq, the soul of my soul. May they rest in peace. It's also a poem for mothers whose mothering didn't teach them anything, for mothers who rejoice when they hear the drums of war, for mothers who have chosen othering, for mothers who will never know peace or love, for mothers who break my heart. It is by design, not by accident, that mothering put an M in front of othering. When you become a mother, you grow to see that M is for mellowing, mildness, mightiness, that M is for the soft you hum into your child's ear when you rock them at bedtime. The soft Reem's grandfather hummed into her ear when he rocked her at bedtime, and when he combed her brother Tariq's hair the way he liked it, then suddenly the soul of his soul was gone. When you become a mother, you have to decide whether you grew to become the mother of the world or the mother of ashes. And so I'll leave you with that. I appreciate you tuning in here this week, and I'll have an interview with another gentleman we're going to rock the boat again next week. And for that, I hope you come back again next week. Sláinte. Thank you for listening to the show today. I hope you enjoyed it and that you'll return again next week for another episode of the Village Oak Tree. This is Shawnee. I hope you will continue to let me come to your village to bring you some news from the outside world that might make you think a wee bit. Please share this podcast with your friends and relations. The more you share, the more we can convince enough people to make the world a better place to live in. As I say goodbye this week, I wish to leave you with this Irish blessing as you go about your day. May your blessings outnumber the shamrocks that grow. May trouble avoid you wherever you go. Slán go fóill.